Killing it.
And now we're here.
We can count. Okay.
My name is Lydia. I am a PhD student, soon to be a maester next month.
Nice.
My field is the lucrative liberal arts field of folklore.
Nice.
And my specialty is women in religion. So that's what I'm bringing to the table here. My complete disclaimer is that while I have read all of the books, I've read all 5 of the books, I've read Fire and Blood and the World Book, I have also slept since then. I have not read all of them multiple times. So just putting that out there, I am not someone who will quote you a text word for word, but no doubt some of you are. Yeah, and perhaps some of you are. So anyway, just putting my cards on the table, not to pretend to know what I'm doing. So go on.
Hi, I'm Megan D. I am a costumer and historian. I work at the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan as a garment and textile specialist. So we do research into what exactly people wore 300, 500 years ago, and we try our best to recreate it with as much accuracy as possible. As far as the books, I have read most of the books. I've read all the series. I've read Fire and Blood. I have not gotten to World yet, and I've read the Dunk series. So, yeah, that's my experience. And so I do have, it's similar to folklore, but of studying history and especially women's roles in history, and especially in the workplace.
Hi, I'm Britt. I'm a Nashville, Tennessee native. I am a performer and intimacy coach in the theater scene there. I also am in corporate learning and development for Uber. No, I can't get you free ride credits. I'm so sorry. I have read all of the books. I have since slept. I have most recently read Fire and Blood and just ate it up, loved it. Actually was listening to the audiobook on the way here, and then quickly had to turn it off because I started falling asleep because I was like, his voice is so soothing. Yeah, I'm clearly House Stark. This is my 2nd year at Ice and Fire and my 1st year on a panel, and I'm very, very excited. So thanks for coming out, guys.
So since this panel is about women and feminism, I think it would be a good idea if we tried to define feminism first, especially because it often is a plural word, isn't it? It's feminisms, right? Just as there are feminists, there are feminisms. Thoughts?
So I think we kind of all know, like, or I guess we shouldn't all, I shouldn't say we all know, but that feminism is usually traditionally broken up into 3 parts: first wave, second wave, and third wave. After that, it gets a little bit fuzzy on what wave we're in.
Post third wave,
post third wave, post fourth wave, pre fifth wave. It gets weird. But I guess we know, or I should say, I know that first wave feminism is usually about women trying to assert themselves outside the house. And you can say this is where it goes back to actually Mary Shelley, actually Mary Wollstonecraft, but Mary Shelley was her daughter. And we usually credit her with first wave feminism. And again, it's women trying to assert themselves outside the house, trying to make a presence that they are not just simply the angels of the house. They can go outside, they can work even, but even if they don't work, they are not simply there to be for the family, to be essentially an unpaid servant to their family. And then second wave feminism is usually where we get, that's where I get confused. Third wave feminism is usually kind of the sexual revolution, I believe. Second wave is when women are trying to actually they've asserted themselves outside the house and they want to gain the rights. That's where we get women's or suffragists and women's right to vote.
women having a more pronounced presence in the workforce.
And so I guess in today's contemporary society, we see feminism as a way for both the equality of both sexes, recognizing that people's experiences are not universal, and that there's a lot of issues that go into what women especially experience, depending on their socioeconomic background, their racial background, their education, and all that. So that's usually where I find feminism today is trying to ensure that equality, that it doesn't roll back, as well as continuing to expand our definition of what it means to not just be a woman, but also be a human.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
I would tack on to third wave feminism in particular, post-colonialism, of course, which is certainly something that can be applied to this series in its own way, because people are being subjugated in lots of different ways beyond sex and gender. But I had a conversation with my husband earlier today when I was thinking about this panel. We were talking about definitions of feminism, and I said, well, I like to use a really simple, cut and dry definition, the empowerment of women. And then we commenced to have an argument about what that meant. And I said, I think that at the heart of this argument, we're disagreeing about the meaning of the word empowerment, actually. And I said, well, how would you define empowerment? And he said, well, it's when you have power over other people. And I said, that is not how I would define empowerment. I would define it as agency, the ability to make choices, the freedom to create imaginative possibilities to live and exist. Yeah. So it seems pretty clear, right, that when we're talking about waves of feminism, that Westeros is not our world. There may be some historical parallels between them, but Westeros is it's a little pre-first wave, isn't it?
Yes.
And as you were mentioning, class is a big part of this, right? And books and show are obviously very different. In the show in particular, you almost only see women who are either of noble houses. There are exceptions, but the majority are either of noble houses or sex workers of some kind. And oftentimes, if they are the latter, they are nameless. Which is its whole other thing. So I guess I would move on to say, what obstacles in the ASOIAF world, or ASOIAF world, I don't know how y'all say it. I've been saying it ASOIAF, and then Don was like, it's ASOIAF.
I'm going to go with ASOIAF. I'm just going to commit to that for the rest of the week.
In the ASOIAF world, prevent the agency of women, do you think?
So, I personally would think that for most women, I would say I'll start with women of nobility. The biggest issue they have is that so people that have read World that may have answered it more of if the first men had more equality in gender. We kind of see it in the free folk, but at the same time you still have that they have this culture of kidnapping women to make them their wives, which is very problematic.
We don't like
it, but and to be fair, that at least from the text and what I've gotten in the text is that this sort of kidnapping is kind of a fun tradition that most people, or at least most free folk, don't have a huge issue with. And part of that does go into, I think, most of the women among the free folk, I would imagine, or at least from what I've gotten from the text, is that if they can't fight back, then they kind of deserve it. That's basically what I've gotten from the text. And but especially Andal culture is that women are there to serve their houses, to better their houses through marriage, and through having multiple children. And in some aspects, they have gone into other circles. We see Black Allie. It was a fighter. She was very well known during the dance. But even if you look at women like Roanne Weber from the Dunk series, is that she was still tied into her father's will, even after he died, that if she didn't get married, then the house would pass on to someone else. She would, if she didn't get married by a certain time. And I think even in the text there, it's quite obvious that Roanne does not like that. It doesn't seem that she's too opposed to having a relationship, to getting married, but she's very much wanting to do it on her own terms, and having that time limit set on her is not great. So, especially I think for at least the noble class, and the one biggest hurdle for them is just this cultural idea that of women being the angels of the house, essentially.
Yeah, it's very much this sense of they are property as well, and I think there's it's a common theme, I think, that you see even if a woman's father is quite loving or really kind of encourages her to pursue her interest. There's still this sense of at a certain age you become a piece to be maneuvered. You become a part of the keep's property in a sense, and so I think that's certainly an obstacle for nobility as well. There's this sense of ownership, I think, that a lot of men, especially father figures, have over young women, especially. So, yeah.
Related to that, I actually think there's something in there about essentialism and the assumed nature of what a woman is in this world. And something that I was thinking about was how manliness or womanliness or femininity, perhaps masculinity and femininity, how these are determined and judged in the world. So how do we know when a male character has become a man? And oftentimes, like I think about Tywin's exchange with Joffrey, like, but I'm the king. A man who has to say that I am the king is no king. In some sense, competence is the way that manliness is measured. Of course, we can problematize that, right? Because in some ways, I think we all know that George he puts tropes there so he can break them down, right? We have characters like Sam and Tyrion who problematize that, both from noble houses, but who are certainly not being treated with the dignity of their personhood either.
Right.
And we can extend that to Theon and other ways. But how is femininity measured in the series? And oftentimes it's measured whether or not the person in question identifies as hetero or cis or binary. That woman's femininity is measured by means of her relationship to the men around her, be it father, brother, potential husband. We see that with Brienne a lot, right?
Yeah.
So that.
I think the interesting thing about, especially with comparison to femininity and masculinity, the two women I can think off the bat who were well renowned for their combat skills are Brienne and Black Allie, both of who are described as being almost mannish.
Yeah.
Black Allie, or Allie, is said that she has a chest of a boy, and that she often smelled of wood smoke rather than perfume, it's almost as though and this is probably, and we kind of see it in our world as well, that women that don't conform to the societal expectations of femininity, or don't perform femininity very well, kind of, they don't entirely get a pass of being able to take on masculine roles. But we almost see that Brienne's family kind of almost gave up on trying to marry her because she was just too mannish. No one liked her, and so the fact that she is also this big woman, she's very tall, that it's almost easier for her to take on the role of knighthood, or at least attempt to take on knighthood, rather than a character like Sansa, who performs femininity very well. And part of that, we can go into whether or not she actually wants to, if that's something she likes doing or not. That's a whole other conversation. But at the same time, and we do see it that she doesn't have much she doesn't have much interest in doing masculine things. But two, we also see that through Septim Ordain and even her father, she's pushed more into those feminine roles. Whereas even Arya is, her father allows her to take sword dancing lessons because he's like, well, he knows that it's something she likes. And again, that goes back to, he is a father figure that cares deeply about his daughters, but even still he pushes, he does tell Arya that you'll be able to give birth, you'll have sons that can be knights and kings and priests, and she's like, well, why can't I be that? But even still, Arya is allowed to kind of dip her toes into those roles that are not traditionally feminine, because she doesn't perform femininity very well. So.
You brought up something in our chat earlier about how do women navigate in this world when they do not have agency.
Yeah, so it's something that I spoke last year at Con of Thrones about pretty extensively through the framework of Sansa, because I think she is the most pronounced character that performs femininity really well. Another character that I really point to when I think about, you have these women in this world that do not have a tremendous amount of agency, and how they navigate around that, and some of the opportunities that they create for themselves. I think a lot about Cersei. I think a lot about Marjorie. I think a lot about Olenna. I think about characters that are hyper aware of their femininity and that are hyper aware of the outside perspective of how people view them, and tweak that to their advantage, right? So it's very much, I think, we see it especially, I think all throughout Cersei's arc, in the book specifically, and I think we also see it specifically with Sansa, especially when she's in the Vale, of courtesy is the lady's armor, right? Or her knowledge of House's heraldry is as sharp as any knife, because she's so aware of it. She knows how to move people in ways that aren't physically moving them, right? But she has other ways, I think, nuances that she uses. So yeah, I think about characters like that when I think, all right, if you don't have a sword, Cersei talks famously about using the weapon between your legs, but Sansa, I think, takes it even a step further, and she uses her wit, her mind, and her knowledge. So
Yeah.
And Olenna definitely takes it a step further.
Oh, 100%.
She plays into the fact that people think that she's this old senile woman. She doesn't know what she's doing.
Right.
So she can move around, and people aren't going to pay attention to her because they're like, whatever. She's probably forgetting where I don't know, the toilet is.
The cheeses
are. She
forgets what order the cheese comes in.
Yeah, and so she's able to listen, and I think that also we kind of see that too as Sansa, is that people don't expect her to be listening as much.
Yeah.
And this is I'll kind of go to the show because this is one of the few things I like, but and I think it shows or exemplifies it very well. When Marjorie is presented to the court, and that's essentially when Joffrey washes his hands of Sansa and decides to betroth himself to Marjorie. And most people are thinking, oh my gosh, Sansa is so upset, like, and she has that face because she's like, but we understand from her chapters that she's like, oh gods, I am free, I can live now, and but that people do, and even when she goes to the Godswoods to pray, that's not her point that she's doing, but she plays a part of it, and that's where I think it's a combination of she both plays into it, but she also wants that solace. And since Godswoods is the one place that she is not going to be bothered because she's in the South and people don't worship the old gods, she can be left alone there, and that eventually does lead to her being able to meet up with Dantos there without anyone knowing about it.
Something that, a word we have not yet uttered, I think, is patriarchy.
Oh yeah.
We should probably bring that up. But would we say, do you think feminism is always opposed to patriarchy, or perhaps how would we define patriarchy?
I would pretty much say that there's very few definitions of patriarchy that would probably be in line with feminism. Like it's like as far as no, I can't even think of any.
Let's define it though, even if we're just stating the obvious here and wasting everybody's time. Let's do it though.
So I'd say is a society with a focus on men and specifically traditional roles, such as the man has to be the father, the leader, the provider, the warrior, and the creator, and all this. They are the one in charge. They are the head of the house, and especially that they are not emotional. And by that I mean they are not allowed to they're not allowed to be expressive.
Unless it's anger.
Unless it's anger,
and
yes.
women conversely may not be allowed to express that emotion because it's reserved only for men.
Yes,
Right.
right.
It's not proper.
So, and especially patriarchy in that way, where it also, I can't even think of a form of patriarchy in which people aren't being hurt in a way.
Yeah.
So
Especially even men.
Yeah, right. So that was going to be the next thing I was going to say is it fair to say that men in this series are oppressed by patriarchy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For
So
sure.
do you think that there are, I don't know, I have this question in my mind and I'm not entirely sure that, I don't know that I like the way that I can think to phrase it, which is, can we think of male characters in this series that we would call feminist or having feminist leanings? But I almost think that's not a fair way to frame that question, right? Because we are applying this, our first, second, third wave ideas to a world that hasn't made it to first wave yet.
Yes.
Right.
But I guess you could word it as, are there men in this? Yeah, go ahead.
Would the daughters be the most furthest on that spectrum?
I would say yeah. I'll get into that. But you could probably word it as then, what men in the series enthusiastically support women without, or like the women in their lives without putting restrictions on it. So, Oberyn, yeah. I was gonna kind of go into Ned. That's where he very much wants to support his daughters, but does put restrictions on them that like they do have to get married. But yeah, like you said, Oberyn, he gives his daughters a choice, and you can kind of get into like whether or not those choices it was actually not even like really not if it was like actually a choice, but like
Well, there's Sorella.
there is Sorella that who
Has to pass as a man to
supposedly
do the things she wants to do.
still not entirely proven, but I think that's kind of like R plus L equals J is it's basically
What about Balon and Yara? What about Balon and Yara?
Yeah,
He's
that
a
one,
fiction, yeah.
that one I would I think, I don't know if anyone else wants to take it, but I would feel that that's a very tricky situation, especially because Balon, his sons, all of his sons were, or most of his sons were killed.
Yeah,
All
she's
three of the older sons were killed. Theon was taken from him, and so he puts her into the masculine role, and
She becomes the son.
she becomes the son, and we kind of see that. And it's probably like, especially in that society, Asha, you're Asha, yeah. Ironborn society is very much not healthy to women, especially, but to men also. And so there was probably that she understands like it's not. I am not going to get very far by being the noble daughter.
She kind of fits into that role.
And so,
herself.
and yes, I mean, like,
She doesn't think of herself as a man. I don't think we get
she doesn't, I don't think we really get any,
Because she's noble born, though, that she's allowed to break these roles, I think. If she were not the daughter of the, Lord, the May King.
of this great lord,
So why don't you think about the Mormonts as well? They're strong women
very
leaders.
good.
We don't
Helena's
see
so happy
enough
about
of
that.
them.
Helena's like,
I think we don't see
Yeah,
enough of the women Mormonts in the books to be able to extrapolate further, and often it's in the context of a bit of a joke. Not always, but like, oh, those bear women.
And what was on with Daisy?
When Daisy's dancing at the Red Wedding, and Catelyn even thinks that it's nice to see her be a female, when she can also be, a commander or whatever it is that her role
She's
is.
also a warrior.
And Rob is very open arms about having her be like at the top of his ring.
But it's expected within the cult. Well, it's accepted and expected in the culture for the Mormont women to be allowed to
it's
fight.
the Mormon women.
Yeah.
And especially because I think it's kind of referenced that there aren't many men on the island, or at least those men are gone so often,
And their
that
options are limited.
they have no other choice but to fight. Whereas we don't see like Barbary Risewell, or Barbary Dustin Risewell, does not. I mean, like, we've never seen any inclination that she has any inclination of wanting to fight like that. But at the same time, it kind of goes into that Northern culture probably is okay with women fighting in the context of that they're usually Mormons, and that's because that's what they do. But if like Jane Poole was to want to do it, her father would probably be like, no, we're not, no, before he died.
So here's a question. Can we think of any examples in book or show where women are happy to be women, where they enjoy being women, where it's something they would have chosen for themselves?
I think you said
Catelyn.
Catelyn is very happy in being a woman, and that I kind of wanted to go into that of saying that there's no woman in the series. I think explicitly says like, Cersei kind of.
Cersei.
That she doesn't want to be a woman, but I don't know if it's ever phrased in the way of I am a man in a woman's body. So we don't have any discussion of like transgender characters. There's discussions of women that are unhappy of being women because they are stuck in this one role, but that does not necessarily mean that they want to be a man.
Right. They just want access to what a man would have access to.
Right. I'm sitting here thinking like, who else?
Ariane?
Sorry?
Ariane Marteau.
Ariane Marteau.
Oh yeah, I think I think that goes into a lot of the Dornish women.
Yeah. Because I love her very much. I get really like on the fence though about that. Not necessarily that I think she's unhappy being a woman, but I do think, and I'm glad that Dorn was brought up because I think that there is a whole conversation worth having about Dorn because I'm of a mind and of an opinion that the empowerment that they give women begins and ends with their sexuality, but they are still very much beholden to, I think, especially Ariane, I think is still beholden to the rules of secession. So we do see her, potentially like suspicious that she will be passed over. And so like we do see her, bucking against that system and even potentially plotting against her own father. So.
Well, yeah, and I think that kind of references that historically Dorn is, what is it, primogenic? Primogenic is that firstborn, first rule. And I think that's where we see Ariane is getting antsy because one, her father's keeping a lot of secrets. And not telling anyone anything. But two, I think we can kind of see it as a way of that Andal culture starting to push its way into Dorne, that she is worried that her father is going to ignore Dorne, what has been tradition in Dorne, and go with what has been happening in the rest of Westeros. And
they're founding heroes.
Yes.
Yeah.
What about the wildling culture then?
The what?
Wildling culture?
Yes.
We mentioned that a little bit before you got here.
I'll kind of go back to it again. But it kind
I'm sorry.
Pulls
Our
in
bad.
that that while women are allowed to fight, there's still kind of like there's still this whole kidnapping routine.
But that tradition can be viewed in another way. I always thought of that as like a form, an adapted form of consent and a proving ritual. That then they have these in some cultures where both of them are actively playing a role in that, as well as other members of their family, and it's not a random thing that happens most of the time. It sounds like these are kind of maybe weak agreements between clans or families or groups of people, and that what did she say? A man can own, or a woman can own something or a knife.
A woman or a knife.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that kind of goes into that. It gets into a very gray area of are these women like actively participating in this? Like, and there's a difference between knowing that this is part of your culture, like rape is part of our society. That doesn't mean that people want it. They definitely don't want it. But like, so I guess what I'm saying is, even if kidnapping is part of the culture, there's the question still of if the women are actively participating in it, or if that's just something they have to deal with because it happens.
I mean, in their culture, it's a survival culture. There are a lot of things that they have to deal with that they don't have control over, that they adapt to.
Cultural like things to be shitty without being necessarily oppressive. There's all sorts of things that are oppressive.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Yeah. I know you
I feel like it's Westeros.
Topping onto that though, I feel like the kidnapping thing also comes down to protectiveness too. It's like the strongest man is the man who's able to kidnap me. So it comes down to a power couple,
And which is a benefit to the one half of that couple.
Yeah.
It is.
Like
Yeah.
it is.
Right.
Seeing someone over here at the question, Kevin.
It's just me again, sorry. So it's a case of, can the wildling women say no as the man's trying to kidnap her and fight back? If they can and they fend off their kidnap her, then the kidnapper is not going to kidnap her. If she is kidnapped, then why is she kidnapped? Is it because the man is stronger than her? So does that mean that she is then relying on the men of her family to protect her? In which case, isn't that reverting back to the patriarchy?
Yeah, and that's like, again, it goes back to that gray area because, like you were saying, that the women can fight against it, but and I don't know if it really goes into how much of, if a woman fights against it and like beats him back, great, and that means she definitely doesn't want him, and she survived, or like she doesn't have to deal with him anymore usually, but there's still the case of a woman that might not want this, might not want that man specifically, and doesn't have the strength to fight back against him.
And she can take the initiative.
But if she doesn't have the strength,
in that society, that's the thing. In society, it's a survival culture. So like, if she doesn't have the strength to fight him off in that society,
It's a proving ritual.
Yeah, that's the better question.
Can a woman kidnap a dude?
Yeah.
Can the woman sneak into
if she wanted a guy
tie up the man, knock out the man with a club, and take the man?
I don't know if it's ever been said in the story.
Yeah, it's not, but like.
I mean, that's
why
how
not?
I met my husband.
Yeah, I was going to say, like.
I guess Jon Snow, yeah.
I guess Ygritte was pretty close to doing that as well.
Yeah.
So.
Jonathan, do you have a question?
No.
Oh, I thought you were
It's my arm.
So, not as much with the wildlings, but just talking about just the tradition aspect. Another thing that kind of goes along those same lines is the bedding ceremony, where you hear, it's something that happens at every wedding. It's something that everybody has to do, but you never hear the women enjoying it very much. It's always like, you always hear about guys taking advantage of so-and-so at the bedding ceremony. Like,
Every Baratheon ever.
There's the difference between the wildlings and the Westerosi. Those are two similar rituals with very different levels of,
And I forget if it's in the books, but in the show, like, Catelyn says, like, there wasn't one at their wedding because Ned would have, like, punched out whoever did it, but it's like, but if that's the only way that it doesn't happen, that shows how problematic that is. Yeah.
Too, though, wasn't it? In the books?
Is that in the books? That's in the books as well?
Yeah.
Oh,
that's
right.
That's a good example of like the purpose of women in marriage and the culture. The point of the bedding ceremony is that someone needs to be outside the door to make sure that
that it's happening. Yeah.
It's making sure the consummation happens. It's making sure she's actually.
And that she's now his property.
Yeah.
And I kind of remember in Fire and Blood when they really go into the tradition of first night, is that it's supposed to be supposed to be an honor.
Right.
Yeah.
But when Allison goes to was it Molestown?
Yeah.
When Allison goes to Molestown, she sees all these women that have been abandoned by their husbands because they just could not stand the fact that she had had relations with another man, even if it wasn't something she had liked to, which is supposed, like the culture is supposed to say that it's like an honor, but we see evidence that they don't like that. Or at least, especially the man doesn't like it.
Said it was an honor.
Right. The narrative persists amongst those whom it benefits.
Right.
Yes.
In order to justify that to persist, where the lived reality for both men and women, there's also that class dynamic at play there.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that
I
never
don't
happens in
think
our
you
society,
really-
right?
I don't think you really see
Right,
first
what?
night, or the traditional first night, I don't know if it was ever really taken with, like, if a noble lady got married within their kingdom. I don't think we
Didn't
ever...
the Butterwell guy, he got killed because he did that with someone who was not common folk.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the Lord of that.
Yeah, what was his name? Something like Arthur Ghost, but not. There was,
Yeah,
it was
so
a fire
dude,
blood.
like, they're like, it's basically, so long as first night was taken with the common folk, the small folk, that's okay. But if you tried to do that with the nobility, that's when they're like, you cross the line.
Right.
That's especially done playing into class dynamics.
Right.
Yeah.
We are talking about the ways, maybe to ask it more explicitly, how does sex both empower men and women at the same time? We're talking about how it hinders, how does it empower them? I'm thinking about Olenna and that when banging the Targaryen was all the rage. Always on trend, my girl Olenna.
You know, she uses sex to drive her political ambitions through movies. That's how she turns that from being home to being a mutual relationship. In the books, obviously, it shows hard.
Yes, she does. Like, she gets Aerosol card
the red
to
hole.
over to her side.
But I think about seduction, though. I think about seduction as a bit like an inverse of the wildling situation. A way that a woman is kidnapping a man. And so you could make an argument that the model, the base model for that, even if it is an inversion, is still beginning with a situation of sexual violence.
Yeah, it's still awful.
Or a situation of non-consent.
Yeah, the over situation.
I think, like, especially when we're talking about seduction, we see Cersei using it especially, is coming from a place of, she does, but of not having the ability to do what she would want to do this herself, but she can't, so she has to talk someone into doing this.
Right.
But as far as, sexual empowerment, at least in the books, Alaya,
What are you doing, George? What are you doing?
She is a sex worker. She is a brothel owner. And her daughter, her daughter, Kaya, who we know they come from the Summer Islands, I believe. In their culture, it's not it's not a shame to have sex. It's not a shame to earn money through sex. And so I could say that's a very small show of how women use sex as empowerment.
Yes.
Who?
Sarah.
She goes over and 3 of her kids actually come and try and
dedicated to
Oh, right.
She lives as
practically being a queen or
in the Summer
But
Islands.
it is also, the outcome of that is also kind of a dissolution of family
Yeah, her father.
relationships.
Yeah, her father completely breaks her
Seven
down.
hours.
But I mean, where she took it with her, who she was.
Sure.
She lived
as royalty in Atlantis.
Yes.
But I agree. Yeah, I think there is also at what cost, right? To the family unit, which I think she was like middle fingers up to the family unit.
And maybe because Sarah also was obviously from a privileged and royal family,
Right.
that helped to turn that outcome. And so perhaps that is a way of trying to claim or find agency in a situation where not everybody would be able to find it, but this is
Right. Because even Daddy-O said, how much do you think people would pay to sleep with a Targaryen princess? So it's so tethered still to her name.
Yeah.
She could be a renowned beauty, but she's got that Targaryen name. People will pay double for that, and that's still tied to back to that patriarchal, structure that's.
Scott's got too much to do. Been able to make it over there and set herself up.
Yeah.
Hey, sleep your way onto a boat. Sleep your way onto a boat. Here we are.
I can talk rules and regs all day. They have a specific
Oh yeah.
That's not sexual at all, it's just who she is, right? An example if you want to stray away from using sex to your advantage as female is the way Dani is always painting herself. I'm a young girl and know little of the ways of wars.
Right.
Yes.
And
That
everybody
very
to underestimate her. And that's not like sexual at all.
No,
It's still
it's
in her
not. But
advantage.
she's like,
And it's still a feminine thing.
Right. Yeah. Which we see Sansa do a lot of as well, and Marjorie.
Marjorie.
Yeah.
Well, Marjorie Tom and things real awkward.
Oh,
Yeah, we're not going to talk about the show with that.
A few consent issues there going the other way.
I mean, we could go into.
Marjorie is trying to empower herself and trying not to end up in a relationship that would be destructive as it was with Joffrey. But again, at what cost?
At what?
And is Tommy a person?
We're going to ignore the show on that part.
Everything but Sir Pounce.
Yes, Sir Pounce is
Sir
okay.
Pounce can stay. But
Sir Pounce
everything else has
can.
got to go.
It's actually quite amazing how the books deal with these very complex issues, and like it's not always right, and it's sometimes very disappointing, but it's almost unbelievable that the show can be almost sometimes universally wrong. Every single time you take something, it's either painful or offensive. It's pretty amazing. It's almost like they're trying.
It's absolutely, I think, fair to get it wrong just as much as you get it right. I think he gets it wrong spectacularly with Lawless. I think that's an consistency. Yeah, it's a joke, and I think that's I've had a lot of cringe-worthy moments with good old George.
Yeah, especially because she's weird. I don't want to say. Yeah, she's kind of. I don't want to say she's entirely autistic, but she is meant to be read as mentally disabled.
Yes.
And that's where she, as well as being a woman, she is mentally disabled, which puts her at an incredibly disadvantage. She's a very vulnerable woman. And Cersei laughs at the fact that she was essentially gang raped during the riot.
Cersei is like the most, misogynist person in the whole series.
Okay, and that's where I know I brought it up in the chat that Cersei, as her own person, is incredibly misogynistic, and it's a very good example of women internalizing that misogyny, and that's where I think Cersei's character is a very good character when discussing feminism, because it is showing that women too can hurt themselves and each other by internalizing the message of society that like you're useless unless you have children, to the point that like even as when she was a child, we see that she asked like, what's the difference between me and Jamie? The fact that he has a dick and I don't.
And they're like, yes.
Yeah, I feel like that is the only difference, and it's the biggest difference.
The scene with her and Tana Merriweather
Yeah.
is I think an excellent illustration of that internalization, because she wants to do what Robert did, and she wants to feel what it feels like, and then realizes she's not really able to do that, right? And it's not as satisfying as she wants. She did try.
Several.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to ask, are there consistent archetypes for women characters in this series? George, of course, puts things there to break them down, right? I don't think this man is a hard and fast category. But, so the woman warrior, that's a big one. I was thinking about the faith of the seven and those archetypes, and you can draw those, but they do bleed into each other very much also. And I also think that it isn't just those, because I can't think of a woman who fits the Smith archetype. There may be one, and if you think of one, you shout it out. Just saying. But I also think that
Just anybody who makes something, they stretch
Or as a
the
worker,
Smith
like my
Well, but I honestly can't think of at least a named, or at least a character that is named more than once, a female character that is named more than once that crafts things.
she's a worker.
Sorry, who?
there you go.
Oh yeah, that's
There's
true.
one.
I think of the Matahari archetype for Ariane.
I in my mind I thought about this as like vixen archetype. Like there's mother and there's maiden, and then like the other side of maiden, or sometimes the other side of mother can be that way. There are certainly women in the stranger archetype category. I think Melisandre, Quaithe. Quaithe is an obvious one.
Lady Stoneheart, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And there is usually a supernatural element to that. I also wondered if scholar was an archetype in there, but really Sorella was the only person I could think of. Well, yeah, but I was thinking about women.
As far as like women,
yes,
I
Sam
think
for sure is a scholar.
Sorella.
Gilly, I feel like.
Who?
At least
In a way, she's sort of following Sam's lead. She's really trying to better herself that way.
You could probably argue that. But yeah, and I think that kind of goes into it that we don't see many women scholars is because they're not allowed to.
Oh, Sandra.
Yeah, I know. What about septas?
So I was gonna say septas, just specifically because I'm thinking about it's one of Jay and Allie's daughters.
Oh yeah.
Miguel.
Miguel becomes a septa.
She's a septa, but I do wonder, are there links that we can find between septas and some sort of scholar?
Miguel does say that one of my gods, I can't remember her sister's name. She can't because
She can't memorize the prayers.
She can't memorize the prayers. She can't read, so she can't be a septa.
Gail.
Oh, okay.
She's the one that right?
The winter
She's
child?
the winter child. She's very slow. Like she can hardly write herself.
It was.
No, it's the one that married the Aaron.
It is the one that married the Aaron,
Is
but
it
I cannot
Dale?
remember.
But it's not. It's not Dale.
Yes.
We'll go with that.
This is what happens when everyone has the same
Internet.
We got a question over here.
Well, I was just gonna add to it, Shireen's a scholar.
Yeah.
She teaches
That's very much so. That's true.
She very much lives on the books,
Yeah.
right? She has no human contact, but she dives into her books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She then teaches novels how to read. So,
Well, the other archetype I see is batshit crazy.
Yeah.
You have Stannis's wife, and
The single white female
I
archetype.
think you see it a
Cuckoo for
lot.
Cocoa Puffs.
I think you see it a lot in Gothic novels of what is it, Wuthering Heights, the crazy woman in the attic.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that as like the dark side of the mother archetype too, though, because Cersei also has a very dark side as a mother archetype, but I'd still kind of put her there.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And Catelyn, when she becomes Lady Stoneheart, while she's the stranger, that is also in its own way a darker side of the mother.
Yeah.
and Lysa Arryn's the other one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning
Yeah.
the dark mother. Wow. I'd put her in a warrior woman category.
Yeah.
But here's another thing though. What are the limitations to this archetypal system, right? Because these boxes are very handy, but in what ways are they not handy? And in what ways does George bleed out of those boxes?
Well, when they say the seven, there are seven faces that are one in the whole.
That is technically what it is.
Nobody's
Yes.
one thing. Nobody's one facet.
So in our last 7 minutes, I ask you.
2 minutes.
Oh, sorry, 2 minutes. Okay, we could do it in 2 minutes. George R. R. Martin has famously identified as a feminist. Is this a feminist book series? Why or why not?
In 2 minutes.
In 2
minutes.
No rush.
I have faith in you.
Oh.
Actually, 1 minute.
If we could spend an hour talking about it,
I know.
there's enough material that there's, put enough there to make people think about it, and that in itself almost achieves that.
Where it is within the structure that he has chosen to make the narrative. This is sort of a medieval era, and his characters are very feminist for the roles that they have to fulfill within this time frame.
Yeah, it is because if you're writing about, now that you said that, you're actually writing about like feudalism, medieval feudalism, and you're using women as characters. It is because there's literally a breakdown of history.
Yeah, I think we can acknowledge that the series itself is feminist, set in a very unfeminist setting, which causes some complications. We get scenes that are very, very uncomfortable to read, and scenes that are just that are difficult to think about because it's it's one of those things that by going back to the gang rape of Lawless and the fact that Cersei is laughing at it,
What happened to Taisha?
or what happens to Taisha is that this is, it's a very complicated series essentially, but I think that we could acknowledge that it is a feminist series with its issues.
Sure.
Yes.
All right. Do you want to get anything else in before we close?
No.
No? So then, thank you for coming. This